Below the sewers and subways of Chicago are over 60 miles of forgotten 19th and 20th century train tunnels. This mysterious labyrinth, once connecting the majority of the city's most prominent buildings, has sat in abandonment and disarray for the better part of a century. Today, we will uncover the forgotten story of the Chicago tunnels. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Around the turn of the century, the city of Chicago was one of the most congested urban spaces in the United States of America. Chaos might even be the most proper word to describe it. Between the horse-drawn carts were streets gridlocked by the pedestrians moving in every direction. And although the city attempted to alleviate these issues in 1892 with the introduction of the elevated rapid transport known locally as the L, the foundation of the new track structure obstructed valuable curb areas otherwise useful for loading. The train commuters indeed saved time, but cargo loading guaranteed lane blockage, wreaking havoc on the trolley cars making their way throughout the loop. Factors were grossly compounded by another component known as coal. You see, coal was a primary power source for Chicagoans, and demand was abundant. Looking back, it's almost ironic to consider that the city literally emerged from ash to become covered in ash. The delivery of coal was a massive element of the cargo logistics impeding the city's quality of life, not only jamming up already overcrowded streets, but dirtying them with the removal of its byproduct, ash. Even the Chicago Tribune gave its warning in 1874 that the huge increase of factories, hotels, and new skyscrapers with their steam-powered elevators was a serious problem. One journalist commented, "So dense is this volume of smoke that unless there's a brisk, stringing breeze, the whole of it settles down in the central part of the city and leaves its dirty imprint." From today's perspective, this type of commentary presents a strong contrast to the tourist-praised city of glorious architecture that we know today. Another example comes from author Rudyard Kipling, who was quoted on February the 8th, 1891, in simply stating that Chicago's air is dirt. Newspaper editors crusaded tirelessly against the smoke horror, proclaiming that the city will shortly be blackened in appearance, new as it is, and grow unhealthier. And although there was not a great solution for the so-called air of dirt, containment of the ash and resulting congestion of the streets could be addressed by moving it all 40 feet below ground. The construction of the tunnels began under the watchful eye of Chief Engineer George W. Jackson, as the Illinois Telephone and Telegraph Company built the first 26 miles of tunnel to hold telegraph and telephone cables. In 1899, a narrow-gauge railway was laid within the tunnels to help with excavation. However, the project stalled after the company ran out of money, and this is where things became interesting. In 1905, the Illinois Tunnel Company took over construction, expanding the network to 60 miles. On July 7, 1905, an 11-car train was dispatched from the Erie Freight House, marking the start of a new era. Stores like Marshall Field's could now move merchandise, packages, and waste to and from their locations. And although it is unclear if the railway was part of the company's plan from the start, they did not inform the city that they were building a railroad until construction was fairly well along. Apparently, there was fear of political interference. To be clear, this railroad was never intended to transport passengers, just cargo. By diverting freight from slow-moving wagons on congested streets to electronic trains running beneath them, it would be possible to move goods of almost every description quickly between railroad stations, boat docks, department stores, and factories. The building of a subway for freight rather than for passengers was practically unheard of. Outside of the famous mail-handling London Railway that would later appear, it was unique on a global scale. In 1902, the company informed the city that they were indeed building a railroad inside of their telephone conduits, and after arduous rounds of negotiation with city council, Lasting an entire year, the company was finally authorized to operate the railways, but with a hefty franchise payment. Construction crews dug tunnels under nearly every downtown street at a depth of 40 feet. This depth ensured that most tunnels would run through clay, which simplified the tunneling. The relatively small size of the tunnels meant that standard train cars could not be used. Instead, especially built freight cars measuring about 10 feet in length and 5 feet in width had to be used. In 1906, the Freight Tunnel Railway opened under the name the Chicago Tunnel Company. Freight loads typically consisted of small packages from department stores destined to mail-order customers located outside of the downtown area, non-liquid commodities of all types destined to wholesalers and large retail customers, coal for building heating, and the removal of heating ash. In 1910, the company reported to the State and Federal Regulation Commission that they had nearly 60 miles of track and 22 connections with railroad freight houses and 45 commercial buildings. It was even estimated that the company's little trains had diverted the equivalent of 1.3 million vehicle trips from the street. Prominent buildings such as the Board of Trade, City Hall, Merchandise Mart, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Chicago Tribune, the Civic Opera House, the Field Museum, and dozens of others all utilized the service. But sadly, the dream was just smoke and things declined fast. The telephone side of the business was disconnected in 1916 due to excessive losses. By 1924, traffic had declined slightly, even though the number of commercial buildings had risen to 60. The following decades only brought further trouble, and the company was only marginally profitable, a relatively low number of connections to online buildings being the primary factor. Unfortunately, the cost of tunneling into new buildings was frequently borne by their owners, and in many cases, it did not make economic sense. For many potential users, it would simply have been cheaper to order a wagon or later motor truck to pull up to the curb. The enterprise's original concept of diverting freight from the street and putting it underground was novel and certainly centuries or more ahead of its time. Unfortunately, the system's physical constraints and the changing nature of the world made its business model impossible to sustain. During the 40s and 50s, connecting railroads had largely discontinued the handling of small packages and had closed or relocated their freight hubs to outlying areas. The construction of the passenger subway, now used by Chicago Transit Authority, had forever severed connections to some of the Loop's most prominent department stores. Motor trucks stole most of the freight business, light manufacturing was disappearing from the Loop, and finally, buildings were converting from coal to gas heating. The end of operations came in 1959, and to help pay creditors, most of the locomotives and freight cars were sold for $65,000 in scrap, as were the electrical distribution systems that powered the trains. All that remained were 62 miles of track, tunnels, foregone entrances, and miscellaneous relics that would almost certainly become faded in time. Considering that one of the world's top minds, Elon Musk, has also recently invested great consideration on building a futuristic tunnel in Chicago, this type of undertaking really does seem visionary. I found the ideas of the former president of the Chicago Tunnel Company, Sherman W. Tracy, to be equally inspired. In his own words, in their economic aspects, the tunnels are an integral part of Chicago's great scheme of trade and transportation, and they serve of time, labor, and money. In their civic value, they relieve street congestion, eliminate wear on the pavements, and reduce the volume of noise and dirt. They offer sanitary advantages in the movements of food and perishables because the tunnels are clean and the air within them is pure and of an even temperature. They are an influence in the lowering of the much discussed cost of distribution. The tunnels are 40 feet under the surface. They are below the sewers, the maze of pipes, wires, cables, and conduits, and are below the level of any passenger subway that may ever be built. They are unheard as well as unseen. Unlike a tunnel through a hill or under a stream, they emerge nowhere. They are reachable only by elevators, and they end against blank walls of concrete. In the process of gathering for shipment by railroad, the freight of each shipper does not go to one freight terminal or in one direction. One shipper may send goods in all directions and over many railroads. As an engineering project, the tunnels measure up to the highest standard. There has been no perceptible settling, and the foundations of the buildings adjacent to the tunnels have remained unaffected. Naturally, the largest business of the tunnels is with the railroads. 2,000 tunnel cars filled with freight are delivered to various railroad terminals daily, and 800 cars are loaded for delivery to local consignees and other railroads. In a year, the tunnels deliver to railroad freight terminals about 650,000 tons of package freight, enough to load approximately 100,000 ordinary freight cars. It would be the natural expectation that these long, dim corridors 40 feet below the street levels would be damp and filled with heavy air. As a matter of fact, they are dry and cool. The ventilation is sometimes too active. Currents of air rushing for the shafts are stirred by the trains, and from the river drifts they blow with chilling vigor. The temperature is practically consistent at 55 degrees. As a provision against dampness, there are 63 electric pumps and a complete system of pipes and 1,100 slumps from which any accumulation of water are raised to the sewers above. There is very little seepage. The tunnel floors are dry and clean. Waterproof and fireproof doors are provided to isolate connections with buildings and commercial terminals in case of fire or water from above. Scientists' tests have shown that the air in the tunnel is remarkably pure. It is drawn up from them through shafts for the ventilating and cooling of many buildings and theaters. The Titanic-style declaration about the safety provided by waterproof doors is perhaps one of the greatest paradoxes about the reality of the system, as its faults would be the thing that brought the Chicago tunnels back into the spotlight, this time in the form of a national emergency. In late 1991, near the Kenzie Street Bridge, a new set of pilings were driven into the riverbed to prevent barges from bumping into the bridge, inadvertently puncturing one of the tunnel roofs. In 1992, a cable television employee in the tunnel underneath the Chicago River videotaped mud and water oozing in where the bottom of the wooden pillar had cracked the tunnel wall. The pilings had been driven only a few feet from the side of the tunnel, and the wooden pilings were visible through the collapsed tunnel wall, where the wet clay had slumped away from the wood into the tunnel. Official response to the reported leak was slow. No emergency measures were deemed necessary, and a formal bidding process began for the contract to repair the damage. On April 13th, some 6 months later, the slow oozing of wet clay opened a clear passage from the riverbed, allowing the river to pour directly into the tunnel, in what became known as the Great Chicago Flood. The entire system was quickly flooded. The Merchandise Mart was the first victim, declaring a water emergency at 5:57 a.m. City Hall began to flood by 6:02 a.m., the Federal Reserve Bank at 8:29 a.m. Finally, the Chicago and Hilton Towers at 12:08 p.m. The long delay before some buildings were flooded was the result of closure of some sections of the tunnel system in 1942, when the passenger subways were built. Many businesses had not realized that they were still connected to the tunnel complex, as openings were boarded up, bricked up, or otherwise closed off, but not made watertight. Eventually, the leak was stopped and the tunnels were emptied within days at great cost. This accident shut down the entire area of downtown Chicago, causing considerable economic loss. Insurance battles lasted for years, the central point being the definition of the accident, i.e., whether it was a flood or a leak. You see, leaks were covered by insurance, whereas floods were not. Eventually, it was indeed classified a leak, which is why some have called it the Great Chicago Leak. Believe it or not, the '92 flood was not the first time that contractors' actions threatened a flood to the city of Chicago by puncturing tunnels. All the way back in 1959, an excavation punctured the tunnel, leading to a dramatic but successful fight to prevent disaster. The risk of flooding was well understood by George W. Jackson, chief engineer who built the tunnel system. In 1909, Jackson received a patent on a portable bulkhead that could be used to seal off flooded tunnel sections. The tunnel developers were also concerned by flooding risk posed by firefighting efforts in buildings connected to the system. Should a building catch fire, immense quantities of water could pour into the tunnels through elevator shafts and basement connections. Watertight fire doors were fitted into all building connections. Small leaks in the tunnels under the Chicago River had become commonplace by 1913. To deal with them, the tunnel company drilled holes in the tunnel wall and pumped out grout at high pressure into the soil outside the tunnel in the vicinity of the leak. So I'm sure you'd like to know what remains of these tunnels today. Well, back when the system was first abandoned, a few special businesses were actually allowed to continue using them. In the 1970s, the city began leasing out the tunnels for utility and communication lines. Contrary to popular myth, none of the tunnels have ever been used for the pedway system, which does not go that far below ground. Amazingly, the Chicago Tribune used the tunnels until 1981 to transport newsprints from their paper warehouse to the Tribune Tower. Prior to 2001, they were popular with urban explorer groups who would sometimes sneak into the tunnels to have a look around. Today, they are securely sealed up, and attempting to access them is highly illegal. For the sake of general comparison, one man served 16 years of a 20-year prison sentence for, in part, having illegally accessed underground Chicago city infrastructure. Today, the only people who can access the tunnel are authorized construction crews or city officials who enter via City Hall. City Hall is the only active access point, and whereas this system is practical from a policing standpoint, it proves to be cumbersome when workers are tasked with transporting heavy equipment to faraway points within the 60-mile maze. Furthermore, in some places cave-ins have occurred, and in others, random sections of the tunnel have been destroyed to make space for new skyscraper foundations, ending up in various dead ends. The inconsistent nature of these changes makes navigation a complete and total nightmare. Now, if you're looking for traces of the tunnel or the tunnel company above ground, your search will be very difficult. Your best bet would be to admire what would have otherwise been low-lying areas of the lakefront built up by the vast quantity of blue clay dug out during the construction of the tunnels. There are also some train carts still in existence. Between 1906 and 1908, the tunnel company purchased a number of Baldwin engines. One of these, number 508, was discovered from a tunnel leading to the Field Museum in 1996. When rebuilding the outer drive, just past the museum, workers uncovered the old Grant Park Disposal Station elevator shaft, and within it was the famous train engine. While not functional, this engine with its cars are now on display in the collection of the Illinois Railway Museum. Surprisingly, the company's most trafficked points, known as Universal Stations, which were parcel drop-off points for shippers who had no private connections to the tunnels, have also vanished. Starting with 746 West Jackson Boulevard, which was also the company's general office, now stands as a parking lot. Looking at the potholes, you almost have to wonder where the original elevator shaft may have been. The Universal Station at Erie and Kingsbury Street is also long gone, but you can make out the fact that there was once a rail yard here, based on the landscape. This area is still heavily exploited for logistics in the modern day. The third station, previously located at Seneca and North Water, has also seemed to have vanished. And the fourth, at Canal and Roosevelt Road, offers nothing in the way of a Universal Station as we would have understood it in the 20th century. But the landscape here really holds on to the essence of a time when Chicago was America's primary rail artery. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with one observation. Outside the glitz of downtown Chicago is a potent feeling of urban industrial decay. And whereas monumental train bridges now dead-end into modern building, the legacy of the time is fading fast. The Chicago tunnel system, however, might just see a future, as it's out of sight and still serves a somewhat pragmatic function for the city. And with any hope, its story won't be lost. You can help the story live on by sharing this video. Also, please consider subscribing to It's History and supporting our Patreon.